Imagine this, a quiet, sunny afternoon on a bustling city street. Cars hum past, pedestrians stroll along the sidewalks, and everything seems like any ordinary day. But in just a few moments, something is about to happen that will make people question everything they thought they knew about justice, power, and prejudice. A black luxury sedan glides down the road, windows rolled down slightly, as the driver enjoys the fresh air. Behind the wheel is a distinguished-looking man, dressed sharply in a suit that speaks of professionalism and confidence. His calm demeanor suggests he's used to being in control, making important decisions, and commanding respect wherever he goes. Little do most people know, this man is a highly respected judge, one of the most powerful in the state. His decisions in court have changed lives, upheld the law, and defended the rights of the vulnerable. But right now, he's just another driver on his way home after a long day in court. As he approaches an intersection, a patrol car pulls up behind him, its sirens suddenly blaring. Flashing red and blue lights reflect in his rearview mirror. The judge's brow furrows in confusion. He hasn't broken any traffic laws, and there's no reason for him to be pulled over. But, like anyone else, he pulls to the side of the road, signaling his compliance. The officer steps out of the patrol car. He's tall, stern-looking, and approaches the vehicle with a swagger that reeks of authority or maybe arrogance. His hand rests on his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his holstered weapon, even though the situation seems far from dangerous. Something about his demeanor feels off. As he approaches the window, his eyes narrow, taking in the driver's appearance with a cold, calculating look. "License and registration," the officer says curtly, not bothering with any pleasantries. The judge, calm but puzzled, hands over his ID without protest. As he does, the officer's eyes scan the card, and something seems to shift in his expression, something that's hard to pinpoint. There's no recognition of the judge's title or status. Instead, the officer's jaw tightens, and his grip on the ID hardens. "You got a problem, don't you?" The cop suddenly accuses, his voice laced with suspicion. "Driving this fancy car around here? What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The judge, still maintaining his composure, speaks calmly. "Officer, is there a reason you pulled me over?" "I believe I was within the speed limit." But the officer's eyes flash with something dark, anger maybe. Or worse, prejudice. "I'll ask the questions here," he snaps. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." This isn't the judge's first encounter with authority, but this feels different. There's a tension in the air, an unspoken power struggle that has nothing to do with the law and everything to do with something far uglier. The judge hesitates for a brief moment, knowing full well his rights, but also aware of the dangerous escalation that could follow. He unbuckles his seatbelt and slowly steps out, keeping his hands visible, his heart pounding a little faster. As he stands beside his car, the officer circles him like a predator sizing up its prey. "What do you think you are, some kind of big shot?" The cop sneers, stepping closer, his tone dripping with disdain. The judge's response is measured, controlled, but there's a quiet strength in his voice. "I'm a judge, officer. I've spent my career upholding the law." But those words, instead of de-escalating the situation, seem to provoke the officer even further. His face hardens, and his eyes flash with something dangerously close to rage. "Oh, so you think you're better than me?" He spits out, his voice rising. "Think you can just throw that title around and expect special treatment?" What happens next leaves both men standing on the edge of a confrontation that could change everything. The officer's hand drifts toward his gun, and for a split second, time seems to freeze. The judge, a man who has spent his life defending justice, now finds himself in a position where his power, his reputation, and even his life hang in the balance. But just before the moment tips over into something irreversible, a bystander across the street pulls out their phone, recording every second. People are starting to gather, their eyes widening as they watch the scene unfold. The tension is palpable, the stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. What's about to happen will either prove the system works or that it's irreparably broken. And what happens next? Well, that's the part that will leave you speechless. In the moments that followed, the bystander's phone captured every tense second, like a damning record of the growing conflict between authority and justice. The judge stood there, heart racing, aware that this confrontation was about more than just a simple traffic stop. It was about perception, about the color of skin and the assumptions that came with it, and about the balance of power in a society that often seemed stacked against the very people it was meant to protect. As the crowd gathered, whispers began to ripple through the onlookers. Some recognized the judge, their eyes wide with disbelief. They knew him as a man who had spent years advocating for fairness in a judicial system that sometimes felt anything but fair. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. To the officer, he was just another black man in a nice car, a stereotype that could easily ignite a dangerous chain of events. The officer stepped closer, his voice dripping with hostility. "You think you're above the law just because you wear a robe? You think you can come into my neighborhood and act like you own the place?" His face was flushed, and his stance was aggressive, legs apart, hands ready at his side. The judge felt a rush of indignation. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had faced unjust scrutiny, every person who had felt the sting of racial profiling. He straightened his posture, projecting authority despite the palpable tension. "I'm not here to cause trouble, officer. I have every right to be here, just like anyone else. You're making a mistake." The crowd had grown, a mix of concerned citizens and curious onlookers, their phones out, recording every second. The judge could feel their eyes on him, some filled with empathy, others tinged with curiosity. They were witnesses to this unfolding drama, each person reflecting the very spectrum of emotions that came with witnessing an injustice. One voice broke through the murmurs. "That's Judge Taylor. He's a good man." It was a familiar voice, belonging to someone who had been in the courtroom alongside him many times. The affirmation hung in the air, but it did little to sway the officer's growing hostility. "Shut up!" The officer barked, glaring at the crowd. "This doesn't concern you." With every passing second, the atmosphere grew more charged. The judge felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and in that instant, he made a choice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up against a system that too often silenced voices of reason and justice. "Officer," the judge said, voice steady and firm, "this isn't right. You're acting on assumptions instead of facts. I'm asking you to let me go." The officer took a step back, still visibly shaken, but unwilling to relent. "You don't get to dictate how this goes. I'm the one in charge here, not you." The judge could sense the crowd's energy shifting, their murmurs growing louder, as people began to realize the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop, it had morphed into a potential flashpoint for everything the community had been grappling with: the struggle against systemic racism, the fight for equality, and the demand for accountability. Yet behind the officer's bravado lay an undercurrent of fear. He was aware that this confrontation could spiral out of control. He didn't want to be seen as the bad guy, but the need to assert his authority was overpowering. He took another step closer, looming over the judge, trying to intimidate him. "I'm giving you one last chance. Get back in your car and drive away, or I'll have to take you in." The crowd gasped collectively. The judge's heart raced. This wasn't just a threat, it was an ultimatum that could lead to his arrest, humiliation, and worse. But instead of retreating, he felt a surge of determination. "You can't intimidate me. I know my rights, and I won't let you bully me." Silence fell momentarily, the tension crackling like electricity in the air. Then, a woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice ringing out with clarity. "You can't do this. He's a judge." Her face was a mixture of fear and defiance as she stood between the officer and the judge, arms crossed protectively. The officer shifted his gaze, momentarily distracted. "Step aside, ma'am," he commanded, but there was a hint of uncertainty now in his tone. The judge felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the collective voice of the community could change the narrative. "This is about more than me," he said, addressing the crowd. "This is about all of us. We can't let fear dictate our actions." More voices joined in, calling out in support. The energy shifted again, morphing from fear to empowerment. The officer, now feeling the weight of the crowd's scrutiny, glanced nervously at the gathering, uncertainty creeping into his demeanor. The tension continued to build, but the judge knew he had to navigate this moment carefully. "We can resolve this without conflict," he urged, his eyes never leaving the officers. Let's talk about this like rational human beings. But the officer's pride was wounded, and as he stood there, something shifted inside him. He was no longer just a cop. He was now a man trapped in a battle of wills, trying desperately to reclaim his sense of authority. You think I care about your reasoning? You think I'm afraid of you? His voice dripped with contempt, the facade of power beginning to crumble. With that, he reached for his handcuffs, and the crowd gasped again, a wave of anxiety washing over them. The situation was teetering on the edge of chaos, and the judge knew they were moments away from a tipping point that could lead to violence. "Wait!" the judge shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "What will this accomplish? I'm asking you to take a step back and think about what you're doing." But the officer seemed lost in his own thoughts, wrapped up in his sense of self-importance and entitlement. He looked at the judge with disdain, as if all his life's choices had led him to this moment. A showdown with a powerful black man who had the audacity to challenge him. "I don't need to justify anything to you," the officer spat, his finger hovering over the button of his radio. "Backup is on the way. You'll see what happens when you mess with me." Panic rippled through the crowd. People began to move closer together, eyes darting back and forth between the officer and the judge, their hearts pounding in unison. The crowd had transformed into a collective force, fueled by a desire for justice, yet terrified of the potential fallout. The judge felt a wave of responsibility wash over him. He was not just a figure of authority. He was a beacon of hope for those who felt voiceless in a society that often neglected them. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice, trying to appeal to the officer's humanity. "This isn't about you and me. This is about the community. People are watching. We can set an example for how to handle conflicts peacefully." But the officer was unmoved, trapped in his own insecurities. "You're not setting any example. You're just another black man who thinks he can get away with anything. You don't know what it's like to deal with people like you." The crowd's murmur grew louder, people shifting uneasily as they began to realize the potential danger. Tensions escalated as the officer's hand tightened around the handcuffs, ready to make a move. "Please," the judge implored, stepping closer but still maintaining a safe distance. "Don't let this turn into something it doesn't have to be. I'm just trying to get home." Just then, a siren echoed in the distance, growing louder, closing in fast. The crowd looked at each other, worry etched across their faces. The judge could feel his heart racing even faster. He knew that when backup arrived, the situation could escalate beyond anyone's control. With a final glance around the crowd, he decided to take one last shot at de-escalation. "What are you afraid of, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "You're a law enforcement officer. You should be protecting and serving, not harassing. Isn't that what you signed up for?" The officer flinched slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted, the desperation in his voice evident. But the crowd was not backing down. They began chanting, "Justice! Justice!" Their voices rose in unison, a powerful reminder that they were watching, that they cared, that they demanded accountability. The officer, cornered by the weight of their collective gaze, hesitated, his bravado wavering. He looked around, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, feeling the pressure mounting on him from all sides. Before he could make a decision, the sirens drew closer, echoing off the buildings, and a part of him panicked. He didn't want to be the officer who had gone too far. And in that moment of hesitation, something shifted. The balance of power felt different. The judge seized the opportunity. "We can solve this right now, peacefully. Let's talk this through." But as the patrol car pulled up, the officer seemed to shrink under the weight of the crowd's gaze, uncertain of how to proceed. Would he double down on his aggression, or could he find a way to back down, to reclaim some semblance of dignity? Two officers emerged from the car, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene, taking in the crowd and the confrontation. The judge held his breath, praying that this moment wouldn't devolve into chaos. "Everything all right here?" one of the new officers asked, eyeing the situation carefully. The first officer's bravado crumbled further. He was being uncooperative. He stammered, glancing nervously at the judge. The second officer's brow furrowed, taking a step closer, "Sir," he said, directing his attention to the judge, "can you explain what's happening?" As the judge opened his mouth to speak, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Every person in the crowd waiting for him to say something that could either defuse the situation or ignite it. "I'm a judge," he began, his voice steady but urgent. "I was stopped here for no reason, and the officer has refused to let me go. We need to resolve this without escalation." The second officer nodded, glancing at his partner, who was now looking increasingly unsure. "We'll handle this. Sir, can you step aside for a moment?" The judge moved slightly, his heart still racing as he watched the officers interact. He could see the tension in the first officer's body, the way he shifted uncomfortably as the second officer began to question him. The crowd was still chanting, their voices rising in unison, creating a collective wave of solidarity that pressed against the officers. They wanted to be heard, to be seen, to fight against the injustice that had been so prevalent in their lives. The second officer gestured for the crowd to step back. "Everyone, please, give us some space. Let us handle this." As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, the judge felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could turn into a moment of change. He stood, heart pounding, waiting for the officers to understand the implications of what had just occurred. But the first officer wasn't done. "You don't understand. I was just trying to do my job," he exclaimed, frustration spilling over. "Doing your job doesn't mean harassing people for no reason," the second officer countered, his tone even. "We have to follow protocol, and this isn't how we operate." The judge watched as the first officer's bravado began to crack, the facade of authority fading. The crowd had spoken, and it seemed their voices had reached even the officer who had started this confrontation. "Look," the second officer continued, "I understand this is a heated situation, but we can resolve this without escalating tensions further. Let's all take a step back and remember why we're here." The judge nodded in agreement, grateful for this shift in the dialogue. "Thank you. I just want to go home and know that my community is safe and respected." The second officer turned to the first, a look of understanding passing between them. "Let's take a moment and regroup. We need to assess the situation calmly and fairly." As the crowd watched, a tense silence fell, filled with anticipation and uncertainty. The judge stood at the center, still aware of the gravity of the moment, but now feeling a glimmer of possibility. Would this be a turning point, a moment where justice began to take precedence over prejudice? Or would the cycle of tension continue, perpetuating a narrative that left the community feeling unheard and unvalued? With every second that passed, the judge's heart raced. He knew the stakes were high, that this was a pivotal moment in their shared struggle for equality. And as he stood there, he vowed to use his position to fight against the very system that had let them down time and time again. But deep down, he understood that the path ahead would not be easy. There were battles to be fought, voices to be amplified, and a community that needed to unite in their pursuit of justice. In that charged atmosphere, he silently promised himself that he wouldn't back down, that he would continue to stand up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. As the crowd began to calm, there was a palpable shift in the air, a collective resolve to push forward, to demand the respect and dignity that every person deserved. The judge took a deep breath, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would ripple through their lives and reshape their community forever. And in the days that followed, the echoes of that moment would linger, propelling the judge into a new role as a leader in a movement for change, where every voice mattered and every life was valuable. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, it became clear that the real work was just beginning. And they were ready. As the crowd settled, their tensions slowly transforming into a determined energy, the judge felt a renewed sense of purpose. But just as he was about to address the gathered community, a loud crash echoed from the street beyond the gathering. The sound cut through the air like a knife, pulling everyone's attention away. The crowd's murmurs of hope shifted to gasps of concern, and the atmosphere thickened with anxiety. From around the corner, a black SUV came barreling down the street, weaving between parked cars, its tires screeching against the asphalt. People stepped back in alarm, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The judge's heart raced. He had witnessed enough unrest to know that this was no ordinary vehicle. As it approached, he could see figures moving inside, 3 men in suits, faces obscured by the tinted windows, their expressions unreadable. The SUV came to an abrupt halt just a few feet away from the crowd. Before the judge could process what was happening, the back door swung open, and a man in a sharp black suit stepped out. He exuded an aura of authority, but there was something unsettling about the way he surveyed the scene. With a quick gesture, he waved to someone inside the vehicle, and the tension in the air thickened even further. "Get back!" he barked, pointing towards the crowd. The fear in his voice felt like a sudden gust of cold wind, catching everyone off guard. The crowd instinctively shifted away, their previous resolve flickering like a candle in a storm. The judge's stomach twisted. He recognized the man. It was a local political figure known for his controversial stances on community policing and development. This was a man who had been a source of tension and distrust in the community for years. Rumors swirled that he had ties to the police force, and his sudden appearance now felt like a dark omen. As the judge stepped forward, ready to confront this unexpected intruder, the crowd was suddenly jolted back to life. People started shouting, demanding answers. "What are you doing here?" Someone yelled. "You're not welcome." Others joined in, their voices a cacophony of frustration and anger, directed at the man who had been a symbol of their struggles. The man smirked, unfazed by the outburst. "I'm here to ensure order," he declared, his tone dripping with condescension. "You people think you can just gather here and protest. This is a public disturbance." The judge felt a surge of adrenaline. "No one is causing a disturbance," he countered, stepping into the fray, his voice rising above the din. "We're standing up for our rights and demanding respect. You have no authority here." For a moment, the man's facade wavered, surprise flashing across his face. But then, without warning, he pulled out a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. In an instant, a loud siren blared from the SUV, echoing through the streets and drowning out the crowd's protests. The noise was disorienting, and panic rippled through the gathering as people instinctively covered their ears, searching for a way to escape the overwhelming sound. Before anyone could react, a group of uniformed officers rushed from the SUV, moving swiftly into the crowd with an air of authority. They were flanked by a few local security personnel, who had clearly been waiting in the vehicle. The crowd, already on edge, began to retreat, uncertainty gripping them as the officers moved in, looking to control the situation. "Everyone disperse," one officer shouted, brandishing his baton. "This is an unlawful assembly." The judge's heart sank. The very moment he had hoped would unite them was now being overshadowed by a display of power and intimidation. He turned to the second officer who had earlier intervened, seeking any support. But that officer was now caught in a dilemma, looking conflicted as his fellow officers moved in. The trust that had begun to build was on the verge of shattering. In the chaos, the judge spotted a familiar face in the crowd, his former law clerk, Sarah, who had always shared his passion for justice. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear and determination. He knew she wouldn't back down, but the stakes had escalated dramatically. "Sarah," he called out, but the sirens drowned his voice. He could see her lips moving, trying to shout back, but her words were lost in the uproar. A flash of anger ignited within him. This was not how it was supposed to go. Suddenly, the political figure stepped closer to the crowd, his voice booming over the chaos. "If you resist, we will have no choice but to take action. We are here to keep the peace." A fire ignited in the crowd, a potent mix of anger and defiance. They began chanting again, their voices rising in protest against the man and the heavy-handed approach of the police. "No justice, no peace," echoed through the street, a powerful reminder of their purpose. The judge's mind raced. He knew that this moment could turn into something far more dangerous if he didn't act quickly. The crowd was pushing against the officers, the line between peaceful protest and chaos blurring. He felt the weight of their hopes and fears resting on his shoulders, and he couldn't let them down now. "Everyone, listen to me," he shouted, desperately trying to reach them amidst the tumult. "Stay calm. We have the right to be here. Don't let fear divide us." But the rising tension was palpable, and he could see that the situation was about to erupt. Just then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed movement among the officers. They were communicating with each other, and he sensed a decision was being made, one that could change everything. The stakes were higher than ever. The crowd was teetering on the edge of rebellion, and the judge could feel the pulse of history pressing down on him. Would he be able to lead them through this storm, or would their fight for justice devolve into chaos? With the pressure mounting and the atmosphere electric with uncertainty, he braced himself for the confrontation that was about to unfold, knowing that the choices made in this moment could redefine their community and their struggle for justice forever. The crowd surged forward, emboldened by the judge's words. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a collective force against the chaos that threatened to engulf them. It was a moment charged with tension, a standoff between the people and the authority that had too often silenced them. The judge felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, his heart pounding as he searched for the right words to steer them through this pivotal moment. "Together, we are stronger," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a beacon. "We will not be intimidated. Our rights matter, and we will stand for them, no matter the cost." His words ignited a spark within the crowd. No justice, no peace. They shouted in unison, their voices ringing louder and more defiant. The officers' grip on the situation began to slip, uncertainty creeping into their ranks as the chants grew. The political figure, realizing he was losing control, stepped back, frustration evident on his face. He raised his hands, attempting to regain command. "You all need to disperse. This is your final warning." But the crowd's resolve only strengthened in response to his threats. Suddenly, one of the officers near the front line, a woman with a weary expression, hesitated. She glanced at the judge, recognition flickering in her eyes. He could see she was wrestling with her duty versus her conscience. The judge locked eyes with her, sensing a flicker of hope. "You're part of this community too," he shouted, addressing her directly. "You know what's right. Stand with us." Her expression softened, and for a moment, the tension in her shoulders eased. The crowd's chants continued to rise, a wave of solidarity washing over them. "We're not your enemy," the judge pleaded. "We're here for justice, just like you." The woman took a step forward, uncertainty etched on her face. "I'm just following orders," she murmured. But the judge could see she was questioning that very notion. Then, as if a switch had flipped, she shouted back to her colleagues, "We don't have to do this. They're not the enemy." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing off the walls of the buildings surrounding them. The political figure, realizing the tide was turning, barked out orders for the officers to regroup. "We will not back down. We are trained to handle situations like this," he declared, desperation creeping into his tone. But the judge knew they were standing on the precipice of something greater than just a protest. "Look around you," he cried. "This is about our future. This is about respect, dignity, and accountability." In a surprising move, the woman officer took off her badge and stepped forward. "I stand with them," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. The crowd erupted into a roar, a chorus of support flooding the air. Seeing their colleague's bold choice, a ripple of hesitation spread through the other officers. One by one they began to step back, exchanging uncertain glances. The political figure's authority was crumbling, and he could feel the ground beneath him shifting. Just when it seemed that victory was within their grasp, the judge felt a sudden chill sweep through the crowd. The air crackled with an ominous energy, and he turned to see more vehicles pulling up unmarked cars with tinted windows. A feeling of dread washed over him. The unexpected arrival of backup shifted the atmosphere from triumph to trepidation. The crowd, once buoyed by hope, now felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down once more. "What now?" someone murmured, fear creeping back into their voices. But before the judge could respond, the unmarked vehicles opened, and a group of well-dressed men stepped out, exuding an air of authority that sent a jolt through the crowd. They wore earpieces and moved with purpose, scanning the scene as if assessing a potential threat. "Who are they?" the judge wondered aloud, his heart racing. The political figure turned, a mix of annoyance and fear etched on his face. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he muttered, his bravado faltering. The newcomers began to position themselves between the crowd and the officers, their expressions serious and calculating. One of them stepped forward, his voice smooth yet commanding. "You all need to step back immediately. This is a controlled situation," he announced. The judge felt a wave of anger rise within him. "You're not in control of anything," he shouted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "You're here to intimidate us. We are demanding justice, not fear." Just as he spoke, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Sarah, his former law clerk. She stepped up beside him, her eyes ablaze with determination. "We won't be silenced. This is our community, and we will stand for what's right." The judge felt a surge of strength at her presence, bolstered by her unwavering spirit. They were a team in this fight, ready to face whatever came next. But then, the unexpected happened. The leader of the newcomers pulled out a small device, and within moments, the crowd fell silent, an eerie calm enveloping them. The device emitted a low hum, a wave of something that made the judge's skin crawl. "We have the authority to disperse this gathering," he declared coldly, his voice resonating through the thick air. "You will all be held accountable for your actions here today." The judge's heart sank. It felt as though the entire moment was teetering on the edge of chaos, and their fight for justice was about to be crushed under the weight of authority. "Is this what you want?" the judge asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "A community torn apart? We're here to build something better, to demand change, not to fight amongst ourselves." The leader scoffed, unimpressed. "Change? You're just making a scene, and scenes lead to consequences." He turned to his men, gesturing for them to move closer to the crowd. "We will not tolerate this insubordination." Then, just as it seemed that everything would spiral out of control, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. It was a young woman, barely out of her teens, holding a sign that read "Justice for All." She stepped forward, trembling but resolute. "This isn't just about us," she cried. "It's about everyone who has ever been treated unfairly. We will not be silent." The crowd responded with a chorus of agreement, their voices rising in unison, drowning out the tension that had been thickening in the air. "No justice, no peace." They chanted again, and this time it was fueled by a sense of urgency and determination that electrified the atmosphere. The judge watched as the young woman's words seemed to pierce through the barriers that had been erected between them and the figures in suits. The unexpected solidarity ignited something within everyone present. The officers began to look at each other with uncertainty, their resolve wavering as the crowd rallied around a shared cause. The political figure's face darkened, realizing he was losing the upper hand. "You're all making a mistake," he warned, his voice trembling slightly. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. As the chant continued to swell, the judge felt a surge of hope. This moment had become a testament to their strength, a reflection of the community's resilience in the face of oppression. They were ready to fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. But just as victory seemed tangible, a blinding flash of light cut through the air, disorienting the crowd. Confusion erupted as people shielded their eyes, unsure of what was happening. The judge squinted against the brightness, trying to understand what was unfolding before him. Then, amidst the chaos, a figure appeared in the distance, rushing toward them. It was a news crew, cameras rolling, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and jeers as they realized their story was being broadcast live. In an unexpected twist, the arrival of the news crew shifted the balance of power once again. The political figure's bravado faltered, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of public scrutiny. The crowd began to chant, "Let us be heard." Their message was now amplified, reaching far beyond the street they stood on. Realizing the cameras were rolling, the judge seized the moment. "This is our chance," he shouted, raising his voice above the din. "This is not just about us standing here today. This is about everyone who has faced injustice in our community. We will not be silenced, and we will demand accountability." The crowd erupted into applause, their collective voice growing louder and more resolute. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound energy that pulsed through them all. The political figure was cornered, his options dwindling, as the reality of the situation sunk in. Finally, as the judge stood there, he realized that their struggle was not just a fight against authority. It was a movement for change, a declaration that they would no longer accept the status quo. And with every heartbeat, he felt the promise of a better future flickering on the horizon, fueled by the determination of those around him. But as the crowd continued to chant and the cameras rolled, the judge caught a glimpse of something unexpected. In the corner of his eye, he noticed the first officer, the one who had started the confrontation, standing a few paces back, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and admiration. In that moment, the judge realized that sometimes unexpected allies could emerge from the most unlikely places. With renewed conviction, he stepped toward the officer, extending a hand. "You can join us," he said, his voice steady. "Together, we can make a difference." The officer hesitated, glancing between the crowd and the chaos behind her. But as the crowd's chants filled the air, the judge could see a flicker of hope ignite in her eyes. She took a deep breath, and then slowly, she took a step forward. Just as the crowd erupted in applause, the political figure's frustration boiled over. "Enough!" he shouted, reaching for the device again, but it slipped from his hands, falling to the ground with a shatter. In that moment, the unexpected twist left everyone breathless. The power had shifted, and the judge knew that this was just the beginning of a long fight for justice, one that would see the community standing united against oppression, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the camera captured the scene, the crowd surged forward, energized and emboldened. They were ready to confront the system, to demand change and hold those in power accountable. And in that pivotal moment, with the judge leading the way, they knew that together they would not back down. The energy in the air was electric, each heartbeat echoing the pulse of the crowd. The judge stood at the forefront, a figure of resilience and hope. With the political figure's authority in tatters and the unexpected alliance of the officers, a wave of optimism washed over the gathering. It was clear that something monumental was unfolding, a turning point, not just for the individuals present, but for the entire community. As the crowd surged forward, their voices crescendoed into a symphony of unity. "We are the change," they chanted, the words ringing out like a rallying cry, resonating deep within each heart. The judge felt a warmth spreading through him. This was more than a protest. It was a movement that would echo through generations. With cameras rolling, the political figure's desperation became palpable. He turned to the crowd, his voice shaky. "You think this is the end? There will be consequences for this insubordination." His words fell flat against the roar of support surrounding the judge. The crowd's chants drowned him out, transforming his threats into mere background noise. Stepping closer to the now vulnerable figure, the judge pointedly replied, "Consequences? No. What you should fear is the change that is coming. You've silenced us for too long, and we will not stand by while you dictate our future." The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of energy that surged through them, binding them together in a shared purpose. In that moment, the judge realized that this was not just about the political figure or the authority he represented. It was about every individual who had ever felt unheard or overlooked. It was about mothers worrying for their children's futures, young people yearning for their voices to matter, and elders longing for a community that respected their wisdom. The stakes had never been higher. The officer who had initially confronted the judge stepped forward, her expression now one of determination. "We are part of this community too," she declared, her voice steady. "We want to serve and protect, but that doesn't mean we have to enforce unjust laws." Her words elicited a loud cheer from the crowd, and the judge felt his heart swell with pride. The political figure's resolve continued to wane, and he began to back away, his eyes darting nervously between the crowd and the officers who had sided with them. The tide of change was evident, and the judge could see it in the eyes of those around him. Their hope was blossoming into action. As the crowd pressed forward, it became clear that they would not allow fear to stifle their voice any longer. "Let's show them the strength of our unity," the judge shouted, urging them onward. Together, they began to march through the streets, a river of humanity flowing toward the city hall, their destination a symbol of power and governance. Each step they took was deliberate, a march toward not only reclaiming their rights, but redefining what community meant. Their resolve forged connections between those who had previously felt isolated. Strangers became friends, allies united by a common goal. The energy was infectious, and the crowd began to share their stories, tales of injustice, of struggles that had felt insurmountable. A single mother stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "I just want my children to grow up in a world where they are respected and heard. We are here for them." Her words struck a chord, and others shared similar sentiments, each story reinforcing the urgency of their fight. As they approached City Hall, the crowd swelled, anticipation crackling in air. The judge stood at the forefront, leading the way up the steps. The building loomed large, its facade a testament to authority and tradition. But today, it would become a platform for change. The judge raised his hand, and the crowd fell into a respectful silence. "We are here today to demand justice," he began, his voice steady. "This is not just about policies or politics. This is about the people of this community and the values we hold dear. We stand united, not as enemies, but as advocates for a better future." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, their faces illuminated by the sunlight streaming down. The judge could see hope reflected in their eyes, a shared determination that was impossible to extinguish. As he continued speaking, he outlined their demands, not just for justice, but for accountability. "We call for transparency in our government, for community engagement in decision-making, and for policies that uplift and empower every individual, not just a privileged few," he declared. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the streets, a powerful reminder that they would no longer be silenced. Their movement had evolved, transforming into something far greater than any single protest. Suddenly, a voice broke through the din, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. It was Sarah, the former law clerk, her eyes bright with resolve. She had gathered her own group of supporters, a mix of young activists and seasoned community members who believed in the cause. "We're here to stand with you," she shouted, her voice ringing out with authority. "Together, we'll create change." The crowd surged forward, drawn by her passion. The judge felt invigorated as he watched Sarah take the stage, her energy infectious. "We cannot back down," she called out, her words resonating with the crowd. "This is just the beginning of a long journey, but together we can pave the way for a future where every voice matters." As she spoke, the crowd erupted into cheers, a wave of unity sweeping through them. They had transformed their fear into power, their silence into song. The atmosphere was charged with possibility. It was a defining moment that would echo in their hearts and minds for years to come. But as the celebration began to take hold, the judge felt a familiar presence at his side. It was the woman officer, her badge now tucked away in her pocket. "What do we do now?" she asked, her eyes searching his for guidance. "Now we keep pushing forward," he replied, a newfound conviction lighting his features. "We engage with our community, hold forums, and educate ourselves and others about the issues we face. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we need everyone to join us for the long haul." With that, the crowd began to disperse, energized but reflective. They exchanged contact information, committed to meeting regularly, planning their next steps. The judge felt a surge of hope as he watched them connect, the promise of something greater taking root. Days turned into weeks, and the movement began to gain traction. Community meetings filled with passionate discussions about policy reforms, social justice, and accountability became the norm. The judge and Sarah worked tirelessly, collaborating with community leaders, engaging with local organizations, and ensuring that their voices were amplified. The political figure who had once tried to silence them found himself under scrutiny, facing questions about his authority and integrity. The tide of public opinion was shifting, and the judge felt the momentum building. Their efforts were beginning to resonate not just in their community, but across the city, drawing in support from neighboring areas. As the movement grew, they organized rallies, workshops, and educational programs. They wanted to ensure that everyone understood the importance of their fight, not just for themselves, but for future generations. They engaged the youth, empowering them to speak out and stand up for their rights. Months later, the judge found himself standing in front of a packed community center, the energy palpable. He gazed out at the faces before him, friends, allies, and community members, united by a shared goal. Today, we stand on the brink of change, he began, his voice steady. Our movement has sparked conversations that were once deemed too controversial to address. We are here to challenge the status quo and redefine our future. A wave of applause erupted, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of camaraderie. The judge smiled, feeling a swell of pride for what they had accomplished. They had transformed a moment of fear into a movement for justice. The days turned into a blur of activity as they strategized, organized, and educated themselves on the issues that mattered. They held workshops on civic engagement, teaching the community how to advocate for themselves and make their voices heard in local government. Amid the excitement, the judge received news that the political figure would be facing a public hearing. It was a pivotal moment, a chance for the community to hold him accountable for his actions. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a sense of urgency among the supporters. As the hearing approached, the judge prepared diligently, gathering testimonies from community members who had been affected by the political figure's decisions. They wanted to ensure that their voices were amplified, that the decision-makers heard the truth of their experiences. On the day of the hearing, the judge arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation. He looked around at the assembled crowd, a sea of faces filled with determination. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, united in their demand for justice. The hearing room buzzed with energy as community members filed in, each carrying their own stories and experiences. The judge took a deep breath, preparing to speak. Today, we stand together to demand accountability. We will not allow our voices to be silenced any longer, he proclaimed, igniting a wave of applause. The hearing unfolded with testimonies that were raw and emotional. Each story added weight to the argument, a testament to the impact of the political figure's decisions. The judge listened intently, feeling a sense of pride for the courage of those speaking out. As the hearing progressed, he could see the political figure shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The evidence piled against him, and the room grew increasingly tense. It was a moment that had been a long time coming, a culmination of their efforts to reclaim their narrative. When it was finally the judge's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his heart racing. "We are not here to vilify you," he began, his voice calm yet resolute. "We are here to demand change. We are here to remind you of the power of the people and the responsibility that comes with leadership. Our community deserves better." The political figure's expression hardened, but the judge pressed on. "You have a choice today. You can continue down a path of division, or you can choose to listen, to learn, and to grow. We are not your enemies. We are your constituents, and we are here to fight for a better future for everyone." The tension in the room was palpable as the judge's words hung in the air. He had reached a turning point, and the crowd could feel it. After hours of testimonies and arguments, the hearing finally came to a close. The judge stood in solidarity with his community, waiting for the ruling that would shape their future. When the announcement came, it was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The political figure had been held accountable for his actions, but it was clear that the journey was far from over. The community celebrated the ruling, but they understood that this was just the beginning. They had ignited a fire within their hearts, a commitment to continued advocacy and engagement. The judge knew that their voices would not be silenced again. They had learned the power of unity. In the months that followed, the movement continued to grow. They organized community events, engaging local youth, and fostering discussions on social justice and civic responsibility. They knew that change took time, but with each small victory, they were forging a path toward a brighter future. One afternoon, as the judge walked through the community center, he paused to watch a group of young people gathered around a table, animatedly discussing their plans for a youth-led forum. He felt a swell of pride. They were shaping their own destinies, empowered to advocate for what they believed in. As he moved through the room, he encountered Sarah, her face glowing with excitement. "We've got a lot planned for the next few months," she exclaimed. "The youth forum is just the beginning. We want to create a mentorship program to connect young activists with experienced leaders in the community." The judge nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for the progress they had made together. "It's incredible to see this momentum. We're building something that will last." As they continued to discuss their plans, a sense of fulfillment washed over him. They had transformed fear into hope, uncertainty into action. The journey had been fraught with challenges, but together they had emerged stronger, united by their commitment to justice and equality. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the community center, the judge stepped outside. He took a moment to breathe in the fresh air, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken. They had faced adversity, but they had also discovered the strength of their unity. The future remained uncertain, but the judge understood that they had already won a significant victory. They had shown the power of community, the importance of standing together in the face of adversity. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself to continue the fight, to ensure that the voices of the community would never again be silenced. It was a commitment to the future, to the generations that would follow, to a world where every individual's voice mattered. As he walked home, he felt a sense of peace settle within him. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but he was no longer alone. Together with his community, he was ready to embrace whatever came next, confident that they would face it with resilience and determination. And so, the story of their movement became a testament to the power of unity, the strength of community, and the unyielding belief that together they could create a better world. It was a reminder that change was possible, that hope could flourish even in the darkest of times. The legacy they were building would endure, a beacon of light for those who would come after them. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the judge knew that their journey was just beginning. Together, they would continue to fight for justice, to advocate for the unheard, and to ensure that their community thrived. They were a force for good, united by a shared vision for a brighter future, and nothing could stand in their way.